Now I would like to hand over to Ruud, who will moderate the upcoming panel discussion. Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jimena, and thank you very much, Modest, for this very nice introduction. Congratulations to you and the Secretariat on this achievement, 10 years of TADAT, and welcome everyone here to this panel discussion and the sessions about this. I think what strikes me is that TADAT is so much more than a diagnostic framework. TADAT has really created a community where people have a common understanding and a platform for discussion on what is good practice. So it goes well beyond sort of this tool. And as you showed, 4,000 people have finished and took the exam on the training. So there's 4,000 people who have this common understanding. What you also showed is that this is a source of information that can be used for research, so we can better understand what are the implications of sort of good practice. And what I also like is sort of you've also created this community through the podcast and through coffee talks, and this is what people can sort of see and watch and exchange on what are the good practices. So. All very nice, and also from your presentation it became very clear that TADAT, by doing these assessments, is not just the assessment, but each assessment contributes to the database that provides the benchmark. And this benchmark is really a public good for everyone, because every country can compare himself to this benchmark. So it's creating a public good that is to the benefit of us all. And I think that is... you showed very nicely, and but also last thing before we go is what I like is the repeat TADATs, where you can really see what is the developments over time. Really interesting to see that there's already 28 of them. So with that, we're going to have a panel discussion. So we have until 10 past half 4, so it's a bit more than an hour. And we're going to discuss both with the providers of capacity development, we're going to discuss with the recipients, with the donors. So we're going to have an exchange, and also with academic, to discuss the 10 years of experience of TADAT, and based on the presentation that you've just seen. So I'm going to introduce the panelists, but you may think there are 4 panelists, and that's true, 4 panelists on the stage, but actually we have 6. There's 2 mystery guests that you will see in a minute, and I'm going to introduce them to you now. But let me start with one that is on the stage, which is Andrea Lemgruber, who's sitting on my very right. Andrea is the division chief of the Revenue Administration 2 division, and that division is in charge of capacity development in Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Then to my direct right is Commissioner General Dingani Banda from the Zambia Revenue Authority. And Mr. Banda has been a leading advocate of modernization and digital transformation projects in the Tax and Customs Administration of Zambia. So glad you are here. Thank you for coming. Then let's move to, well, they're no longer mystery guests, but they are on the screen, so we can see you. Roxana Rua, you can see on the right on the screen. Roxana is the head of the fiscal policies sector at the European Commission's Directorate General for International Partnerships. And she is leading a team of experts dedicated to supporting EU partner countries in domestic revenue mobilization and public financial management. Also on the screen is another colleague from the European Commission. That's Gabriela Chirkova, the deputy head of the Unit for Revenue Administration and Public Financial Management, and she's in DG Reform, the Directorate General for Structural Reform. So welcome both. We'll get back to you in a second. Then I go to my left, and that's Mary Bain. Mary is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the Africa Tax Administration Forum, ATAF. And ATAF serves as an African network that aims at improving tax systems in Africa through exchange, knowledge dissemination, capacity development, and active contributions to regional and global tax agendas. And ATAF also joins many of the TADAT assessments. Then to my very right is Dr. James Alm. Welcome. James is the Professor Emeritus of Economics at Tulane University. And he has done extensive research on the behavioral responses of tax. For instance, in areas of tax compliance, but also the marriage penalty or the marriage bonus in the tax system, opportunity zones, housing choices, economic growth, corruption, interesting work on voluntary disclosure schemes and tax amnesties. And he has also worked on fiscal decentralization reforms in many developing countries. So that's our panel. So we're now going to have 2 rounds of questions for the panelists. And after that, there's an opportunity for you to raise questions to the panelists. So you can already start thinking of what you would like to ask them. And we'll get back to that for the last 20 minutes of this discussion. So Andrea, we're going to start with you. So what, in your view, are some of the most important results of TADAT for tax administrations in developing countries? And to what extent have the results of the TADAT assessments been used in guiding CD?
Okay, so thanks, Ruud, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me start by saying if I can think about 2 main results, the impacts of TADAT overall, I would say first, helping us understand in a very integrated, clear way, and structured, I think like we mentioned, a structured way, like what good practices are for tax administrations. And Catherine, you used the word revolutionary, and I think it is. Like really like TADAT has been a pioneer in saying, okay guys, let's get together, let's discuss the practice, and let's have a kind of language of common understanding. It seems easy, but it's not, right? Because think about before TADAT. Like we could go to a conference or a meeting, we could say, oh yeah, I heard like that country, that region is doing well on this, but you know, there was nothing structured. And so we do have now the field guide, and it is amazing because everybody refers to the field guide as a point of reference. It's written, it's there. So I was thinking, okay guys, like let me ask you, how many businesses do you know that have a field guide like we do have, like with practices, right? And saying, okay, like you can go and check what the frontier of our businesses is. And not many, probably. And this is the importance of TADAT for revenue administrations, tax administrations, and this applies to everybody, from low-income countries to advanced economies. The second one is really trying to show that tax administrations operate in an end-to-end cycle. And I call this tax administration A to Z. And why is this important? Because it's not enough to say, oh, I'm good in one area, and then I fail in other areas. Why? Because tax administration is an integrated cycle. So I see many times when we go in CD, administrations that invest in auditing, for example. And then they do a good job, they have lots of tax assessments, taxpayers dispute that, and guess what? They all get stuck in dispute resolution systems that don't work. So in the end, we were not effective in improving tax compliance, in mobilizing revenues. So TADAT is very visual on this with the will. Like you needed to be good at everything, and I think we show, Modeste, you showed that it's still very imbalanced. So in terms of our practice route, CD, I would say we use TADAT as our baseline, especially because more and more And we are here celebrating also the GPFP, like our medium-term view and projects, like more and more we engage in medium-term reform programs, and we need to have a clear baseline. And a baseline that is a common understanding with the authorities, and of course, understanding weaknesses and strengths. So we saw POA2, risk management, not being so good. And then we work a lot in terms of compliance risk management. So it's a way that we link things together. I think we measuring also, gauging this progress. It's very important for us. Many practitioners here and partners, we know it's not easy for us to say, what impact do you generate on the ground? And with the repeat TADATs, as we saw, we can see, because we are applying the same structured methodology 5-8 years later, and now we can see, okay, do we move the needle or not in terms of our programs? So that's very important too. And final things from me, I think like you just mentioned, the analytical side of it. So after 10 years, the database is just amazing. We could see how many dots in that scatter plot. And if we join this with our ISORA, our International Survey on Revenue Administration, RA-GAP, and other tools that we have, we are just sitting on an amazing and rich database that now it's linking analytical power back to CD. And so I'm seeing like our CD is becoming more data-driven, and of course, we are providing much more efficient and effective CD to our membership.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Andrea. So TADAT, revolutionary, and also the fact that it's a comprehensive framework, the tax administration system, and that you cannot sort of let one thing go, and very important messages. Thank you so much. So, Commissioner General, you're a recipient of, so to say, the TADAT assessment. What have been the impact of the assessment and also the training in Zambia? And perhaps you can also say something about countries in which you've been interacting.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start by congratulating TADAT for the 10th anniversary. Zambia Revenue Authority, we have been part of the history of TADAT in the sense that in 2013, we were one of the countries that was involved in the pilot on TADAT. And 2 to 3 years later, in 2016, we went through our first performance assessment reports, and then the follow-up was in 2022. And the importance of TADAT cannot be, overemphasized. It's a critical game changer. It's very important for tax administrations to have a reference point, an international benchmark that you can use to measure how you are performing, your strengths and weaknesses. As Zambia Revenue Authority, we took advantage of that and embedded it into our planning processes as an institution. So to start with, in our assessments, one of the fundamental issues we did, particularly on the issue of raised on training, is that we ensure that a number of our members of staff are trained on the TADAT framework. So overall, we've about 80 members of staff that have been trained on the TADAT framework, both the physical and the online version. And using that now, it gave us a basis now to ensure that even as we participate in the performance assessments, we are highly expectant in terms of what are the key performance outcome areas that are being measured and what is the criteria behind that particular score. So using that, we ensured that our members of staff were actively involved in the 2 TADAT assessments that were carried out over the period. And the most important part also is the after assessment, what do you do with the results? So for us, we again use the members of staff to develop a remedial action plan, which fed into our corporate strategic plan. Looking at now, what are the issues that were identified as our strengths, but most important, the weaknesses. How do we make sure we address the weaknesses in our subsequent strategic plan? And our strategic plan also forms a basis for engagement with cooperating partners to identify where are the weaknesses, which are the areas that need to be identified. So training, very key. Internal capacity building, very key, but most important, feeding into the corporate strategic plan. And with our Zambia, we've made sure that we incorporate the key results area. I'll give an example. One of the findings in our 2022 assessment was that our domestic taxes was not integrated. We had direct taxes and indirect taxes operating separately. And working with the USAID, Revenue for Growth, we've now operated a new model where we've created a single large taxpayer office. And that has been achieved within the course of this year in Q1. We also had a weakness in the sense that our VAT performance has been quite bad in terms of on-time filing, aspects to do with the compliance generally, and also timely payment of refunds, which Modesta raised here. And we've embarked on a more ambitious program to address VAT, starting with migrating to electronic invoicing system, where we've benchmarked with Rwanda, and we're now in the process of implementing an electronic invoicing system, which we've called Smart Invoice. We're also working with IMF on a VAT control program, where we're actively trying to address aspects, including compliance risk management, which have not been existent in our environment. We are also working on the issue of using of third-party data as a basis for us to cross-check how valid the declarations that are being made. Again, in that space, we are working with the GIZ to build our data warehouse, which is called BIDA in Zambia. And using that also, we're creating interfaces with other third-party institutions. Another weakness that was identified is that we had not carried out a tax gap study. And with USAID and UNU wider, we're now carrying out various tax gap studies, which are forming a basis now for us to know the various gaps. So it has formed a basis for us, like I indicated, to identify the weaknesses, fit into our strategic plan, but most importantly, also benchmark with other countries within the region. We've worked closely with Rwanda. In fact, our mutual administrative agreement was benchmarked on TADAT. What is Rwanda good at? What are we good at? What are we weak at? And then we compare and say, what assistance are we going to get from each other? And that formed the basis now for us to work on the model for the electronic invoice, which we are implementing. And also looking at the support we're getting from the IMF. The key issue is that we've been partnered with Peru and Paraguay. Our team went there to see what is it that they've done better in terms of VAT control. So you can see that at the local level, at also international, regional level, international level, TADAT is helping us now develop that framework that we can use as an international basis for us to make progress in addressing the various weaknesses. So that's what I can say in a nutshell for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this. Really interesting and inspiring to hear that how you have sort of learned from countries in the region like Rwanda, but also teaming up now with countries from Latin America to sort of learn from their experience. Very interesting. So we're going to raise a question online to Roxana. Roxana, you are one of the donors, and so maybe from your experience, you can share with us how TADAT has helped mobilize support for tax administration reforms in beneficiary countries.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, although virtually. Thanks, Ruth, for your question. I think there are many ways in which TADAT has helped mobilize external support for tax administration reforms. I will highlight three of them. First, TADAT assessments have been instrumental to identify the most pressing areas for reform in a given country by giving a precise overview of the strengths and weaknesses in its systems. And in this way, it also helps partners identify, together with the authorities, the specific areas in which their support is likely to make the greatest impact. Second, I think a strong asset of TADAT is its evidence-based approach. TADAT assessments follow a solid methodology which makes them comparable across countries and regions, but also across different periods of time through the repeat assessments. So TADAT can be used to monitor reform progress over time, which allows partners to assess the effectiveness of their support and to adjust it as needed. Third, TADAT assessments provide a good basis for coordination among different partners. I think this has been mentioned already. It gives them a common foundation on which to base their capacity development activities, And in that way, it fosters consistency and complementarity in the support provided by partners. Let me give you one example. One of the most recent assessments that the European Union financed via the RMTF took place in Malawi. It was a repeat assessment finalized last year. So following the performance assessment report, the Malawi Revenue Authority requested support to develop a medium-term reform strategy addressing the weaknesses identified in the TADAT report. As a result, a post-TADAT reform plan was designed to identify a number of key reform actions and to establish a timeline for their implementation. Both the TADAT assessment and the post-TADAT report informed the design of several programs by Malawi's partners. These include the IMF's Extended Credit Facility, the World Bank's Fiscal Governance Program for Results, the Economic Governance Program co-funded by the EU and GIZ, and the upcoming EU budget support operation in the PFM sector in Malawi, which will include two important indicators on the share of large taxpayers filing their VAT returns online and on making the Revenue Appeals Tribunal operational. So this is just one example of a case in which a TADAT assessment was the basis of a reform action plan, which then was supported by partners in a coordinated manner. So to conclude, TADAT is an important instrument in the EU toolbox to support tax administration reforms and domestic revenue mobilization. As you know, the EU is a long-standing partner of TADAT with a €4 million contribution to the Secretariat and several assessments financed so far, both in the EU and outside. And that's why this is really important to us that the TADAT Secretariat continues to be provided with the human and financial resources it needs to conduct its activities independently. So we will follow with interest how the new setup will work with the integration of TADAT within the GPFP, including on governance and budgetary aspects. And we hope that the independence of the TADAT Secretariat will be preserved in this new setup, as it's the most efficient way to ensure that TADAT continues to be seen as a powerful, robust, and objective tool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roxana, for sharing this, and also thanks for all the support that you've been providing. And indeed, the idea is to maintain the Secretariat as it is. Very interesting also to hear from you about sort of the structure, the diagnostic, and then the follow-up on that with the strategic plan, as we also just heard from the Commissioner General. So interesting examples. So Mary, let's move to you. You're one of the partners providing TADAT assessments. So from ATAF's perspective, how do you assess the collaboration among the CD providers in the use of the TADAT framework, and what are the main lessons that you have learned?
Thank you so much, Ruud. I'll also start by congratulating TADAT on your 10th anniversary, and I thank you for your kind invitation to ATAF. As one of the partners, I totally agree with your initial remarks where you said that we have become a community, because the work that TADAT has been doing has been extremely useful in all our work. And I really base my response on largely the work that has been happening in Africa, because that's the work where ATAF has been involved. And I think we started the partnership in 2017, and since then we have participated in 24 TADAT assessments on the continent, and these assessments have been really, really an eye-opener for our work. And the key areas of collaboration where I would like to really focus on are three. The first being that TADAT, by its nature and by its structure, has been very fundamental in helping us to have a firm basis of the capacity building work that we carry out in countries. So previously, maybe to give a bit of perspective, the work that we do largely is to build capacity on the continent and provide technical assistance. And because of this, a lot of our work is demand-driven. But TADAT has enabled us also to provide supply-driven support, because once these assessments are made, then it's easy to see where there are gaps and address those gaps. So the first area, therefore, of collaboration has been a firm basis for our capacity building work. And wherever there's a TADAT assessment carried out, we can hit the road running because we know the areas that need support. So that's one part. The second is something that maybe we don't focus on a lot, but it is the interaction between the different partners. Because of that interaction, we have noticed that it has reduced a lot of duplication in the work that we do. Because we have these discussions and because we are able to provide our different inputs, it helps everybody to grow and to understand the needs better of the recipient country. And this has been really, really invaluable. The third area has been the communication. Because of the work that we do in these assessments, we are able to determine the weakest points, and we are able to help those countries and communicate as a team on how we can best support this. So where I think maybe there can be some improvements, the first one is maybe I listened to Modest well. He did say that at least 620 people have been trained as assessors. I think there's a need for continuous professional development of the assessors so that people don't just rest in their laurels, because as he concluded, there's so many things changing. And because of that change, it is important for us to continuously try and build that capacity. The second area is maybe we should think of setting key performance indicators and say, yes, there's been an assessment, but after this assessment, then what? Should maybe some of the assessors then be able to help this country? Because just like you request initial information and then follow through during the assessment, the assessment, how are we able to follow through and see that these are actually being implemented? And if they are not being implemented, who can go in to support them? Because we're now working in this as a partnership. I think, and then lastly, again, this is very similar. It's really the coordination between the different assessments and monitoring and evaluating how these are actually happening and encouraging people to have repeat assessments, because if you looked carefully at what Modest said, these are actually helping countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary, for sharing this. And interesting to hear how you see TADAT also helping the development partners coordinate among the same sort of priorities identified in the assessment. So we already heard a few times about the importance of TADAT producing information and producing data that can be used for other purposes, including research. So my question to you, James, is how useful has TADAT data been for research purposes and the knowledge of tax administration systems?
And now for something completely different, an academic perspective here. Thank you, Ruud and Catherine and Modest and Huang and Jacqueline as well. Let me focus on the two issues that Ruud has addressed to me. How useful has TADAT been for research purposes, and what more can we do with it? I doubt if I'll say anything that most of you don't already know, but here goes anyway, and you get what you pay for. So here are three ways in which I think TADAT has been especially useful in research, some of which have already been emphasized here. First, policy advice on tax administration, and as we know, tax administration is tax policy, must be based on hard evidence rather than speculations or impressions or anecdotes. And TADAT data provide this hard evidence based on an identical methodology applied to all countries in the same way. And these data are now starting to be used in quality empirical work, as demonstrated by various research papers that I've seen and have been provided to me. Especially a very nice recent paper by Hassan Adan and his colleagues quantifying the revenue yields from tax administration reforms. I wish I'd written the paper. Second, the initial focus of TADAT was on central government tax administration. And indeed, I sat here at the IMF, not in this particular nice room, 6 years ago, almost on exactly the same date, looking at the progress over 4 years. And at that time, there was virtually no analysis of subnational tax administrations. That's changed a lot. Of the 180 assessments on the TADAT website, 45 now are subnational governments, and I think that's especially useful and a nice contribution. Third, as has been emphasized here, tax administrations have a range of responsibilities. Most obviously, they enforce the tax laws, but they also provide services. And there's growing evidence that the ways in which taxpayers respond to enforcement and services is affected by the trust that taxpayers have in government and government tax administration. The entire TADAT framework, I think, nicely incorporates all three of these functions. What in other work with colleagues, I've termed 3 paradigms for tax administration: an enforcement paradigm, a service paradigm, and a trust paradigm, and which also overlaps with World Bank work on tax reform and tax administration. I think having the IMF with a major initiative that emphasizes all 3 of these paradigms is tremendously useful in sending a message to tax administrations around the country that they are not simply enforcing laws, they are also providing services and trying to build trust. However, what more can be done? And in particular, what more can be done to enhance research? Well, as was mentioned, the TADAT database is meant to be a public good. And for a public good to be most effective, it needs to be non-exclusive. By my count, only 47 of the 180 assessments on the TADAT website are publicly published. If you really want to get outside researchers involved in research, they need to have access to this. And the IRS Joint Statistical Research Program may be a model for what might be done. Second, and more fundamentally, as I read the various TADAT documents, the emphasis that I take away from that, and which has to some extent been corrected by the nice discussion up here already, is almost entirely on what the various grades or scores are. And that's obviously entirely appropriate for tax administrations. And people here have shown the positive aspects of these data. However, from a research perspective, I believe that this could lead to an undue focus only on the scores in and of themselves. Surely we don't really care about the scores themselves, in and of themselves. What we really care about, at least what I really care about as an economist, is what these scores tell us about what I will call the true outputs that we want any tax administration to deliver. Specifically, does an improvement in a particular dimension score, or a particular indicator score, or a particular performance outcome area score lead to an improvement in these true outputs? And what are these true outputs? They're things like tax revenues, tax effort, compliance rates, tax gaps, compliance costs, equitable distribution of tax burdens, a range of things that everybody here knows far more about than I do. Or even broader aspects like trust in government. In short, how do TADAT scores link to these true outputs? And so I would argue that to be most useful, at least for researchers, TADAT needs to be better able to link its administrative scores with these development outcomes. And I think that's starting to happen. Again, refer back to the Hassan Adan paper. I've just heard that Catherine and colleagues are working on the ways in which these relate to tax gaps. But I think more emphasis on those links, especially with outside researchers, like moi, would be quite useful. In any event, I applaud TADAT for the great progress that's already been made. I believe it is a tremendous contribution to improving tax administrations around the world.
Thank you so much, James. No, really interesting and important to emphasize, first of all, the fact that publication of reports is important to reveal all the information, also the underlying information. And then that, of course, we ultimately want to understand how the TADAT scores translate into outcomes, because this, first of all, teaches us about how sort of the validity of the TADAT scores themselves, but also it can teach us something about what should be in TADAT. What are the new areas, for instance, that we should pay attention to from research, and how that can be linked to TADAT itself. So thanks a lot. So this was the first round of questions. We can now go to the second round. And so the first round was pretty general about the value of TADAT. The second round is more going into some of the results that we have seen. And I'm starting with you, Andrea. So one of the issues that came from the report and from the presentation by Modest is an area where most tax administration are struggling to make progress, which is tax debt management. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on what are the reasons for this, and what are the implications and lessons for you as a CD provider?
Yeah, thanks, Ruud. And well, that's an interesting finding of the TADAT, assessment. And once again, the importance to know data, no? Because that's a good example that having data available, we can really dig down and try to now shape our CD to improve, for example, tax arrears. So in this case for TADAT, we are talking about arrears becoming older. Actually, what it means in this indicator is that arrears over 12 months now have a larger share of proportion in relation to the overall arrears. And why is this bad? Because, of course, if arrears are older, they become more difficult to collect. So at one point, we can even say that it's uncollectible data, arrears, and then it's becoming a big problem for tax administration, including on the perception of compliance, right? That's going on in a country. And mentioning again, how can we use data to be more analytical? We also took a look at the ISORA database. Many thanks to Liz that it's here with us to see, okay, what ISORA is telling us. What is the difference between TADAT and ISORA? ISORA, I will have more countries. It's a larger database. It's self-reported. Then it's not it's different from TADAT in this sense, but I have annual data as well. So, and it's very similar. We see from ISORA also that arrears are not improving. Actually, we don't see a trend coming down. So that's the question, what is happening? We had a discussion last week with my colleagues in my division, some possible causes for that. I would say starting from the pandemic. Of course, a huge external shock on tax administrations. And we know that many tax administrations put in place some measures to alleviate the financial burden on taxpayers. Let's say just one could be installment plans with a longer profile. And of course, maybe, it became more difficult to follow up after that. And in our CD, we have been observing that the capacity to enforce collection has not been restored after the pandemic. So at one hand, what I'm saying is that, well, we provided more leeway to taxpayers. We needed to do that at that moment. But on the other hand, after some years now, we are not fully back in terms of enforcement powers. So that's one lesson, right? Then some colleagues mentioned SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Why? Because in many developing countries, SOEs are responsible for a large share of arrears, tax arrears. There is a very important political economy aspect there, we all know. And SOEs also have been impacted by the pandemic. We know they were used as policy instrument to alleviate issues okay, we needed to continue providing energy, water, for example, even if citizens could not pay. This deteriorated the financial positions of SOEs, tax debts, and here we are, with the difficulty of recovering this debt. So pandemic as a big general topic. Other structural issues, I guess I will refer to my point, the integration of all functions. We are seeing administrations focusing a lot on registration. Let's increase the tax net, very good. informal economy, let's put more taxpayers in the tax net, and filing with all the digital trends, e-filing, very good results, but they forget about collection, no, the collection powers. So again, a bottleneck in the cycle that may generate arrears. Like people were saying, collection powers, enforcement collection is not a so sexy function in the tax administration. So in some sense, we don't invest there, and then we have accumulation of arrears. And probably the last one that I would mention is that in some countries, the functions are fragmented. And this is a good reminder of TADAT also being not only a tool to measure the tax administration health, but the tax administration system health, right? So there are other sometimes stakeholders that are involved that are outside the tax administration that are very important for the results as a whole. And in many countries, like the collection function is not integrated in the tax administration. It's a model, it's okay, but because of the agencies don't talk to each other, and after the pandemic, we can see also something happening there in terms of this conversation, a deterioration in the following up of the arrears. So possible, more detailed causes for why this is happening.
Thank you, Andrea, for sharing. And it was good that you mentioned also ISORA, which is a complementary database that also provides information about the time series. Which is really important. This is a collaboration with other institutions. OECD is involved, CIAT, IOTA, but important source for research also. So, CG Banda, a question to you is related to another challenge for most tax administration, which comes clearly out of TADAT, which has to do with the integrity of the registered taxpayer base and the effective risk management. So how do you and other authorities address these issues?
Thank you very much for that question. It's a very practical challenge that we have, particularly even in sub-Saharan Africa. And for us, the integrity of taxpayer register and the issues to do with effective risk management, those are the building blocks for an effective tax administration. Now, the challenge mainly is arising from the structural weaknesses, just to build on what Andreas has just talked about here. In a typical administration in our region, the revenue authority is in a silo. It's operating away from the institutions that provide the data that is used for you to build a tax register. I'll start for a registered company. In most cases, the registered company will run its own database, its own systems. That's if they've got the systems. In other cases, it could be manual, away from the tax administration. So the register of companies will have more companies registered than what you have in the revenue administration if the two systems are not talking to each other. The second issue is the civil registration system. In most countries, the civil registration system is manual. And unlike maybe here, where a social security number, you can use it for a number of different transactions. In developing countries, a number, a tax certification number, a social security, it's like you have a number for each of the interactions that you have. So as a result, you find that there's no single point of engagement between the civil registration system, as an example, and the revenue authorities. And in most administrations, the civil registration process is still manual. So you have cases where dead people's identities are being used to create tax records, for example. So that creates a major loophole. And for us, I think the fundamental issue in terms of tax registration lies in ensuring that the tax administration is integrated to the ecosystem for company registration, for civil registration, and then you have a basis on which now to build your register. And then on top of that, you go now into the third-party data validations. Is there another transaction that these players are conducting in the broader ecosystem? Are they dealing with government, suppliers of goods and services to government, or other private sectors? And that interface now between the revenue administration and the other third-party players, it could be government departments, the ministries responsible for lands, the ministry responsible for finance, and the broader suppliers in the economy. A key component is needed to that. And at a third-tier level now, we'll be looking at a broader integration now with the private sector. And this is where, in our case, we're pursuing the agenda of electronic invoicing. Are there players out there conducting transactions, but not in the register for the Revenue Authority? And the fourth tier now is taking it to the global level, where Zambia now, we've joined the Global Forum on Transparency and Exchange of Information. How do we make sure that any illicit flows that could be outside there, you're able to do data matching at a lower level and identify it? So identifying a tax register, having an accurate tax register, particularly in developing countries, would require concerted efforts in building this ecosystem, besides just looking at internally within the tax administration. Where is the tax revenue interacting with other players? At what points of engagements? We have typical cases where a player is active in the economy. They are formal everywhere else. They have a formal identity, formal mobile number, formal bank account, but when it comes to tax administration, they're informal. They're not known there. Those are typical problems we have on the ground. So to involve developing this strong ecosystem where the tax administration is highly integrated into all these touch points that are involved, where the taxpayer is involved. Equally, risk management just builds on that. If your foundation is weak, if the revenue administration is not integrated with other ecosystems, then you have an ineffective risk management, if at all it exists. But where it exists, the key issue is making sure you harvest this data, build also that into knowledge that should be able to drive your compliance risk management. I think that's where the missing link is. So having an effective compliance risk management. And not just covering domestic taxes, but looking at customs as well. Because part of the weakest link starts within the administration. Those of us who are fortunate, we're running both customs and domestic taxes. And we find cases where the active importers, active exporters, when it comes to domestic taxes, they're filing new returns within one administration. Those are typical cases that you find. So this ecosystem must be built from within. You go to third parties and even grow up to global level. And covering that, identifying those who are supposed to be registered but aren't registered, how do we apply risk management in the whole operation of a revenue authority? That's what I can say in a nutshell. Yeah.
Very good, very interesting. I'm afraid I have to contain myself because maybe if we have time after this round, we can maybe ask you to say something about your digitalization strategy that you have in mind, because you sort of very much into the digital transformation. So how important is that for instance, digital ID and the issues? But maybe we do that after finishing this round. Okay. So next question is for you, Gabriela. Welcome also. And so question to you is, what lessons did you learn from the DG reform assessment approach and the multi-country peer-to-peer TADAT workshops?
Can you hear me well? Good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, we hear you well.
Very pleased. Thank you. Very pleased to be here with you this afternoon to celebrate the 10th anniversary of TADAT's achievements. The experience that I will share with you this afternoon is rather recent, but I think it's an interesting take on the way how we actually work with TADAT, how we use TADAT assessment in the European Union. I myself represent the Directorate General in the European Commission that is focusing on support member states with structural reforms. So what we do is we focus on the design of the reforms, but also, and most importantly, more and more, we also accompany the member states' administrations along the implementation of the reforms. And we do it across all the sectors in the economy. Myself represent now the area of taxation. We work also on demand, so we engage with the tax administrations when they want to engage in reform projects. It was only actually back in 2022 when we were looking at how we could use TADAT for our tax administrations in the European Union. We offered the chance to use it, and we have now 3 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece, who are almost close to finalizing the project. And this is the experience that I would like to share with you today. The reason why I could not be in Washington with you today is actually because we are launching another multi-country TADAT assessment with new member states. It's Czechia, Slovakia, and Malta, and we are here also with the colleagues from the IMF and from the TADAT Assessment Secretariat who are joining our country teams. So also greetings to them to this. So on our experience, I would like to share basically 3 key points here. And they relate primarily to the way how we actually work in DG Reform through the projects with tax administrations that are based on demand. The 3 points relate firstly to the way how we work. We work more and more in a multi-country way. Secondly, what we do with the TADAT assessment through our projects, we don't end up there, we don't end up with the assessments, we continue to accompany the administrations further. So embedding the follow-up after the TADAT assessment is part of the project that we are launching now and that we are almost closing in the other 3 countries. And thirdly, what is mostly important at the very end, but cannot be missed, is support with communication, engagement with stakeholders, campaigns, and others. With the multi-country way of working, it has been increasing in the past years, the way how we work more and more. You may wonder how one can actually achieve to address the key challenges of one administration in one country and at the same time do it in one go for all of us. I mean, or more of the countries that are part of our projects. The way we do it is through a really good structured project design, so that we capture actually both elements. We leverage on the similarities of the regions, of the countries that participate, but at the same time we take time and dedicate the resources also to the individual work with each of the tax administrations. At the same time, what we have been doing here with the 3 countries, and we actually start the same way of work together with the new 3 countries, is that some of the activities happen simultaneously, and they all happen together. So these countries meet each other, the administrations, colleagues meet each other for the first time and continue working together throughout 15 months, 20 months of time. So they train together, they learn the methodology together, we organize the assessments at the same time, and the teams have then a chance to exchange also on each other's scorings, and this way they really learn. So the lessons learned is what everybody has been already saying here this afternoon. It is really the way how we work, an excellent opportunity to create a community of practice. We learn from each other and we facilitate it more and more, and colleagues really enjoy that. And this way, what is also important for us from the perspective of the Commission, from the European Union, is that we see that this way you kind of embed in the DNA of the people the ownership of the reform process. It starts from bottom up, and this is really the basis of successful structural reform. Secondly, what I would like to mention, and rather briefly, is the way how we follow up on the TADAT assessment. As I said, we don't stop there, but we continue to work with the administrations on the basis of the assessments. So we further look at the areas that are prone to improvements. We look at which areas to prioritize for further reforms, and we also accompany them along the way to adjust their strategic plans in the administration. And we work also then bottom up with the managers so that the acceptance of the process, of the selection, is justified and accepted. The way the added value here is clear for us, because we see that it creates a little momentum in the administration to actually be aware that something is prone to change, and when it's well communicated and accepted, then the next steps are easier for the people in the administrations. And thirdly, communication. Communication is, in general, or may not be so self-evident feature of a successful tax reform, but the way how we have been seeing reforms go, and the fact that structural reforms really take time, and needs to be accepted, need to be understood by the general public, by all the stakeholders, by companies, by people. It is becoming an essential part of the way how we work with the administrations when they decide to reform, to undertake reform and go on the next steps. We also accompany them with a way how to engage with stakeholders and communicate well publicly. And this is really important for not only the political level, but also for all the stakeholders around. So with this, I would like to close my short intervention. TADAT has been really becoming the baseline from where we start the structural reforms, and it's becoming quite a demanded tool that we support also EU member states with. But through the way how we work in DG Reform, we actually do go and accompany the administration a little bit further with the prioritization of the reforms, or with finding a right time to talk and engage with stakeholder community. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. That's much appreciated. On the good example of indeed peer-to-peer exchange, and also the importance of communication. So that point is very well taken. So Mary, we already heard from Modeste during his presentation about the repeat TADAT results and the progress that was achieved in Africa. So what do you think maybe the reason for that? And maybe you can also share with us how you see the value of the repeat TADATs.
First of all, I want to say that it's a keen observation. Indeed, the repeat assessments have clearly shown that countries have made advances in terms of implementing the reforms that were suggested. And I tried to look at the repeat assessments in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Zambia, Uganda, and South Africa when I was preparing for this. And I just want to use the example of Uganda again, like the good professor next to me said earlier. A lot of this is really not in the public domain, so you have to dig a little deeper and use influence to get this data. But I want to use an example from Uganda. And in the initial assessment, which was done in 2015, they scored a C in effective risk management. And in the repeat assessment that was done in 2019, they did get an A, showing that there was, substantive improvement. And I want to say, to give some of the reasons that I think, Modeste gave 3. I agree with you that I think a combination of the 3 is really why the repeat assessments are good. But I want to give some factors that I think contribute to this. The first is that the TADAT assessments, the repeat assessments, provide focused reform priorities. And so the countries are able to focus on key areas that were identified as weak. The partners are also focused on those to try and help them to overcome these weaknesses. And that is a key advantage of the repeat assessments. And here I want to say that if you look at what has influenced a lot of our work, in 2023 alone, ATAF was able to deliver at least 180 technical assistance missions in the different countries, and most of those were really based on what had been found out, during these TADAT assessments. So I can imagine even the other partners also do the same. So the second is there is a high level of commitment that comes with TADAT assessments. And I want to say here, I can't remember who mentioned the fact that usually the focus is on the administration and then less so on the policy. But with TADAT, because there's always an involvement of the Ministry of Finance and the other key players, it creates a sense of ownership. So once the report comes out, everybody is, sort of like, it's an awakening for everybody. And they say, well, we need to, get up and smell the coffee and do our work and do it right. So you find that these repeat assessments, because everybody is looking at that. But I also, when I listened very keenly when Mr. Banda was speaking, there's also an issue of, there's also an advantage of now comparing yourself to those who you think are doing well, and to see what you can learn from them and what you can teach them. So I think that level of commitment, that level of peer, support is really, really critical. For me, those are the key things that I think repeat assessments provide. Then whether these repeated assessments are highly useful, yes, I definitely agree that they are very useful because they provide the countries with an opportunity to see if they have, improved. So the first one is really, they help in identifying reform priorities and strategic plans. Again, Mr. Banda did mention that they do even have a dedicated team that looks at those reforms and how they are being implemented. If you look at all the countries, almost all of them have those kinds of teams. And so the repeat assessments then, once they happen, they find that the teams have sort of like tried to strengthen all the bolts where they previously they had been loose. So I think that is a key area. And then the second is in terms of measuring the progress. So these repeat assessments also help when you go into these countries for repeat assessments, the interactions that we've had, you find they're very excited about them, but at the same time, they're also apprehensive and wondering, are we going to be scored well? Have we improved? Or are we still stagnating? So for me, I think that is another important use. And then a critical thing is identifying persistent challenges. Like the register that we talked about. I think so identifying those challenges, again, helps the revenue administrations to deploy their resources better because they know their weakest points and therefore they try and address those. And then finally, strengthening partner support. And I know because I've spoken to a couple of development partners who sponsor this, and when we are having these engagements, they talk to us about these assessments. I know we've spoken to the FCDO, to our colleagues in the Netherlands, and many others. And all these assessments help them to focus better their support to these countries. So I think the repeat assessments are really good, and I think they help better. Why they are more prevalent in Africa, I think for those very reasons, because they now understand where the problems are. They also are keen about the repeat assessments. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Mary. So TADAT also strengthened commitment. I think that's a very, very important lesson. So James, last question to you. You already spoke about sort of how TADAT results can be used in research on sort of performance. We also heard about ISORA. If you were the boss of TADAT and from a research perspective, what would you wish for? What would be your sort of ideal TADAT measurement?
What would I wish for? First, I'll repeat and emphasize several of my earlier 2 points on what I would wish for. As a research economist outside the IMF, first, I think TADAT needs to do a better job of making its assessments publicly available to researchers. Economists, at least academic economists, are cheap dates. Give us the data and we'll work for free. For the most part. Second, I think TADAT needs to do a better job of linking the TADAT scores with the true outputs of development outcomes, which I think we're fundamentally interested in. And I think that's starting to happen. But what else would I wish for? A couple things. One, I was participating recently in a discussion of what the U.S. IRS might do with its increased budget, which seems to be decreasing over time. A common refrain was whether the money should be spent on more enforcement or versus better services. And the common answer was that this really depends on which strategy yields a higher return on investment, about which on the enforcement side we know, on the services side we don't. Well, calculating this return on investment requires, among other things, quantifying the effects of an improvement in services, for example. And especially it requires knowing the cost of the investment. And these costs, as far as I can tell, and I'm not privy to most of the TADAT data, don't always show up in the TADAT documents that, at least the ones that I've seen. It's essential to quantify as much as possible the possible cost of tax administration improvements, which I suspect is going on now, and it's just, as an outsider, I don't have access to that. Finally, as I read the various research papers, words like correlation and associated with appear frequently when talking about the connection between TADAT scores and outcomes of various types when that work takes place, leading to a frequent statement along the lines of, it is not possible to isolate the direct effects of any capacity development provided. In the lingo of economists, what these statements implies is research does not have a clear identification strategy that allows causal conclusions to be drawn on the effects of tax administration reforms on outcomes. So what can be done here? Well, two specific suggestions. One, which actually shows up in the Adan paper that I mentioned before, is synthetic control methods. Now, they argue in the paper that that doesn't really generate the true causal identification. I'm not entirely convinced of that, in part because I have a couple papers that use synthetic control where I've argued that at least under some assumptions, you can make causal, at least quasi-causal conclusions from these. Looking at the effects of flat tax reforms, for example. I'm happy to provide that paper to anybody foolish enough to be interested in it. Second, my own conceptual framework is to think of essentially a tax administration production function, as suggested by Richard Byrd, the late, great Richard Byrd. Where inputs are related to outputs. So what are these inputs and outputs? Well, the outputs that I have in mind are essentially what I talked about earlier. Not the TADAT POAs, but the more fundamental true output that I discussed earlier, like tax gaps and things like that. As for inputs, I believe that the POAs and the 32 indicators and the 55 dimensions are really the inputs that we're interested in that are related to the outputs of the tax administration. In any event, what I would hope for is that all these inputs and outputs would be quantified, as really is already done for inputs. And in fact, the beauty of the TADAT framework is that these input, grade of B in any of these dimensions is supposed to mean the same thing whether it takes place in Uganda or Botswana. So that's a uniform statement that you don't necessarily have for ISORA's data. And the relationship between inputs and outputs would be used to estimate a tax administration production function, an efficient frontier, and the resulting estimates would show how a change in an input would lead to a change in the output, and would ultimately be used to draw specific lessons for specific countries on how specific administrative improvements lead to specific development outcomes. And in fact, there's a well-developed methodology for estimating production functions that has been applied more frequently to tax administration. I will immodestly say I have a paper on this that is flawed in many significant ways, but nonetheless shows the basic methodology that uses data envelopment analysis and stochastic frontier analysis. Fortunately, I'm working with people who know far more about these things than I do. I'm kind of a dilettante on this stuff. But so I can throw around the terms, but I need to be working with somebody who actually knows what they're doing. Maybe this approach is not feasible. I believe that it is, and it's been applied elsewhere. And I would encourage TADAT to consider both synthetic control methods and production function methods in terms of additional things that I would wish for. Again, I applaud TADAT for the tremendous contributions that it has made and that I'm sure it will continue to make. And I think everyone in TADAT should be applauded for these efforts.
Thank you so much, James. And I think we all listen, and I think the real boss of TADAT has also listened very well. Thanks a lot for your suggestions. So our time is almost up, but I do want to ask the floor if there's some burning questions. We can take two or so. There's one, and there's the minister in the front. Please, state your name and...
Thank you. I'm Srinivas Gurujada. I'm head of PIFA Secretariat, quite similar to TADAT. And we recently did a stock take of PFM tools. There are 64 today, and I would like to compliment TADAT Secretariat for being one of the most well-maintained frameworks, respected and growing. Hearty congratulations to TADAT Secretariat and everyone. My question is to the Commissioner General. Zambia has been an example of using the frameworks, the PIFA framework for overall PFM and TADAT framework for tax administration. What has been your experience in bringing all this together together to enhance the overall effectiveness of PFM reforms in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then we take the other question, Juan, and then I'll give you the floor for the final words.
Thank you, Ruud, and thank you for the panelists. I want to just make a reflection on something that James was saying in terms of what do we measure with TADAT. And when we initiated TADAT, the main focus of TADAT is outcomes. What are the main outcomes of a tax administration system? And I underline system because it's not organization, it's system. And when we set the outcomes, there is some of the areas where the outcome is very easy to focus. For example, filing and payment. A good outcome is to have a very high filing and payment rates. Very simple. However, in the several areas that TADAT tried to assess the tax administration system, is not easy, it's not straightforward. We, for example, discuss for compliance or the effectiveness in terms of audit, etc. What we discussed at the beginning said, well, the best thing, we should measure non-compliance. Well, very few countries were measuring compliance. And this is why we created the REGAP program, in order to help countries to systematize this. So when there was not an evident outcome indicator, what was the approach we followed? We said, okay, let's try to identify some good practices that country has good outcome. And then we follow this indirect approach. So when you see the TADAT framework, you have both. In some cases, you really have outcomes. In other cases, you have good practices. But TADAT framework is not about good practices. Good practices is an indirect way to say this country should produce good outcomes. But again, the focus is outcome. And it's an outcome of the tax administration system again. So when James referred to the kind of outcome development, this is well beyond the tax administration system. For example, when you consider, let's say, tax revenues ratio, yes, it's good that the kind of impact of the tax administration improve that. But if you have a tax policy change that goes exactly in the opposite direction, you're not going to get an increase in tax revenue ratio. So is this implies that the tax administration is bad? No, because it's a much complex set of consequences. So I would like to call this attention because sometimes I see that because we measure a lot of good practices, we said, okay, this is TADAT is about good practices, but it's not. What we measure in good practice said, okay, we don't have a good outcome indicators, but we observed some good tax administration that had good outcome. And said, okay, what are the good practices there? And then we said, if you do some good practices, well, you should have some good outcomes. But we are working with countries in how to systematize better measurement of outcomes. And again, I repeat, our REGAP program that tried to measure tax gap in VAT, income tax, etc. This is the purpose, because when we launched TADAT, there was none. Very few countries performed this. So when I see challenges in the future, I ask myself, how much we have progressed in developing new outcome measures in tax administration? And this is part of the second panel. So it's an advertisement for the second panel that I will be chairing. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Juan. Much appreciated. And now we're talking about advertisement for nice sessions. Tomorrow is another session which talks about various sort of quantifications of tax that can be used in identifying good practices. So REGAP is part of that, ISORA, but also others. So just some little advertisement because I'm moderating that session. I want to give the last word to the Commissioner General.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question, Srini, that you raised. I think if you look at any administration, it's undisputable the fact that you cannot run tax policy so disjoint from the administration side. And the TADAT provides us with that platform to identify what are the priorities from the tax administration perspective. What are the key reforms that need to be driven? And in our environment, that was actually sanctioned by the Minister of Finance. So you can see a keen interest from the Minister of Finance to see that TADAT is implemented. But when we come to policy also, there's an interplay. There are policy measures that will have an impact on administration, and the two have to work together in tandem. You remember in Zambia, you were in Zambia, we worked on under the Public Financial Reform Program, we worked on a number of reforms under PFMRP that touched on tax administration and so forth. And if you look at TADAT, there are some aspects there. For example, the fact that the revenue administration must be connected, the systems must be connected to the IFMIS for finance. Those are some of the key priorities that we take up and provide a linkage between what the policy side is pushing and the administration side is pushing. And I must mention that Zambia is one of the few countries that has developed its own tax administration system. And in terms of the importance of that issue, is that the part of the TADAT reforms that needed to be done, we had the capacity on our own to implement. As an example, when a company is registered now in Zambia, immediately the Revenue Authority issues a taxpayer identification number with the institution that issues the registration. And previously, the two systems would have totally different numbers. And the other reforms, including the interfaces that are being done with Ministry of Finance, IFMIS, all these now being driven internally as part of the development phase. So that's part of the issues that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for all the panelists for their contribution. And going back to Jimena.